Those of you who know Ron know he's extremely talented. He has an incredible bio. You can go to FPRI's website and read it. He's written books. He teaches. He's brilliant. But one of the things I appreciate most about Ron is his ability to consistently and regularly take wide, complex, almost unwieldy subject matter and weave it into something that's approachable, that's usable, and that's fun at the same time. A very unique skill set. We're thrilled that he's back to moderate tonight's session. Ladies and gentlemen, Ron Granieri.
Well, thanks, Michael, and thank all of you for coming tonight. I hope that you enjoyed the preliminaries, and I hope that you'll enjoy the conversation that we're going to have. I am Ron Granieri, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America in the West. I'll be the moderator of today's discussion, and all of us at FPRI are delighted that you can join us for this panel discussion on the geopolitics of oil in an era of oversupply. And I have to confess that title is my fault. And I wanted to pack in as many buzzwords as possible because I think that we are actually going to try to address each of those buzzwords. We're going to talk about geopolitics, we're going to talk about oil, we're going to talk about whether or not we really are talking about oversupply. Now, as Michael said, right, the Foreign Policy Roundtable is FPRI's program, one of FPRI's many programs, that tries to engage local professionals at all levels of their careers to encourage an interest in foreign policy in general and, honestly, in the FPRI in particular, by inspiring conversations about world affairs that are relevant to your experiences and to your current positions. So tonight's conversation will explore the interrelationship between geopolitics, economics, and the material world by focusing on one of the most valuable, volatile, and viscous commodities in modern history. I am referring, of course, to oil, black gold, Texas tea. For those of you of a certain age, you might know the reference I just made. Since the first wells brought forth petroleum from the ground, oil has been an indispensable lubricant of the global economy, both for the wealth that its exploration, production, and refinement has created, and for its role as the primary source of power, heat, and propulsion for the industrialized world. Its economic value has also made it a crucial factor in geopolitics. The greatest consumers of oil have not always been the primary producers. Establishing and maintaining links between those two groups has been a central question in international relations for more than a century. For the United States in particular, concerns about access to oil for both itself and its allies have shaped, some would say, distorted definitions of national interest with profound material and human costs. And for all the justified discussion about alternative fuels, it is likely oil is to retain its global significance for some time to come. Thus, it remains a source of political debate, whether the price goes up or comes down, and discussions about its implications will be controversial whether we are discussing the political futures of oil states, from Saudi Arabia to Russia, to Venezuela to Pennsylvania, the practical challenges and environmental costs of extraction, whether they come from tar sands or hydraulic fracturing, or the meaning of energy independence in an interdependent global marketplace, all of which explains why we are here tonight. So how does oil shape contemporary international and domestic politics? How do we balance the need for oil today with hopes for alternatives tomorrow? Will fracking bring energy independence or merely escalate our dangerous addiction to fossil fuels? Those questions, and yours, will guide us today in our discussion with our three panelists. And I'm going to ask that we're going to move this podium and microphone out of the way so that the panelists can come and sit up on the stage with me. Thanks, Mike. Like this here at FPRI, we are full service, right? You know, we are moving service and all this sort of thing. So I'd like to ask my three colleagues to come up on stage. I'll introduce you one at a time. Frank Gunter is professor of economics at Lehigh University and a senior fellow in FPRI's program in the Middle East. After receiving his doctorate in political economy from Johns Hopkins in 1985, Frank joined Lehigh, where he has won multiple awards for teaching excellence. His most recent book, The Political Economy of Iraq, Restoring Balance in a Post-Conflict Society, is based on 25 months as the senior civilian economics advisor for a multinational corps to the United States government in Baghdad. He's also, you can see Frank is a very well-prepared young man, and he has also published on economic development in China, Colombia, and Latvia. Having served 35 years on reserve and active duty, Frank retired as a colonel from the United States Marine Corps in 2008. Wojciech Wolf is a senior fellow with FPRI's Program on National Security and an assistant professor of political science at Rutgers-Camden University. His current research focuses on U.S. foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and energy security issues. Holder of a BA from Binghamton University and an MA and PhD from the University of Colorado at Boulder, Professor Wolf is the author of Winning the War of Words, Selling the War on Terror from Afghanistan to Iraq. His teaching interests include U.S. foreign policy, security studies, national security policy issues, and U.S.-China affairs. Welcome. And last but not least, Stephen Kopitz is Managing Director of Princeton Energy Advisors. Previously, he managed the New York office of Douglas Westwood, where he led projects related to oil field services and technologies. He's also been an investment banker with Dahlman Rosen Company and established and headed the private equity advisory service for Deloitte and Touche in Central Europe. He holds an undergraduate degree in history from Haverford College, an MBA in finance and accounting, and a master's specializing in international economics from Columbia. In addition to testifying before Congress and speaking on oil and the economy, Stephen Kopitz writes frequently on energy topics for a number of publications, including Foreign Policy, Oil and Gas Journal, and World Oil, as well as being the primary author of Princeton Energy Advisors' Mostly Energy blog. Welcome, Stephen Kopitz. Please have a seat. So, now that we're all here and we all know who everybody is, I just want to start with a basic question for all of you, and that is, what factors have contributed to the recent sharp decline in oil prices? I'll let you fight it out among yourselves over who gets to go first.
Well, as the oil consultant, I guess I'll take a crack at it. So principally, the most important aspect has been a surge in supply, most notably from U.S. shales. So since 2005, U.S. shale production represents about 75% of all supply growth globally in the oil supply in the last 10 years. That really accelerated in the middle of last year. And then came the Saudi the realization that the Saudis would not cut production in the face of a surge in UN supply, which led to a collapse in prices. Demand has also been weak recently, but I would argue that it's primarily a supply story.
Supply. All right, well, then let me ask and follow up with Frank then. Is the current drop, if it's a matter of oversupply, is this a blip or is this the new normal in oil prices?
Yeah, Bloomberg last week, I think, brought together a whole series of consultants talking about what's the price of oil going to be. Mm-hmm. And the range was $30 to $200 a barrel.
That's true.
Consultants are great people, great people.
You just have to hedge it and you're fine.
That's right.
Yeah.
Move those markets.
I think that's the big question. Is this like 2009, 2008 high oil price, 2009 they dropped and then they popped back up again in 2010? Or is this like the 2 decades we had from 1985 to 2004 with oil being in the $50, $60 range? If I was a betting man, I'd say that this is the new normal, that $100 a barrel oil was the exception. And I think we're looking at a future of a decade or so of $50 to $60 a barrel oil, adjusting for inflation. I think it's being driven, this new lower level of oil prices is being driven by some of the supply issues you talked about. But also on the demand side, the US, the Japanese, the South Koreans have disconnected the growth of GDP and the growth of oil use. Since 2010, our GDP has been going up, our oil use has been going sideways. So I think it's the new normal.
Well, let me follow up that with you then, Woj. Since when prices were going up, mm-hmm. the easy answer everybody gave was, well, you got the Chinese.
Yeah, China.
Well, they're still there,
mm-hmm.
and they still burn oil. Yes, they haven't moved off of oil. So what role does China play in all this?
Well, China's role is interesting because I've been pushing this idea that oil matters in politics for about 8 years, mm-hmm. and there's a tension between the market side and the geopolitical side. where the market side just assumes that this is a fungible commodity, that it's clear, it's transparent, we know everything there is to know about trading oil, and there's very little that politics can actually help to explain. But on the geopolitics side, which is mostly what I want to focus on tonight, oil is a component of the bigger chessboard. And what you're seeing now is a larger role for geopolitics amongst the oil producers and amongst the oil consumers. And I don't foresee a large, catastrophic, singular event that's going to come about and impact global markets. But what I do see is, to borrow a title, is the building of a perfect storm where you're going to have multi-regional incidents that are going to impact the energy market. But those incidents themselves are going to play a much larger role. But if you're in the business of trading oil, then that's going to impact a lot of what you're doing.
Well, let me go back to you, Steve, on the question of production. If this is a matter of supply is driving down the price.
Yep.
One of the arguments for why people were looking for new sources of supply was because the price was so high.
Correct.
And that when the price is high, it makes oil from tar sands or oil from fracking or oil from all kinds of other places, makes it worth doing. Does the fact that oil is now hovering around $47 to $50 a barrel, does that, are we talking about just the market will now lead to backing off from those new sources of supply, and therefore the price will just go right back up when people can no longer make money fracking or shipping bitumen?
Yeah, I think the question is, what can U.S. shales really produce in volume over a long period of time? And I can assure you that this is a bloody debate we're having every day with people who are very good at their jobs.
Yeah.
So if the presumption is that the U.S. shale production can continue to grow at its current pace at a price of, say, $70, then the high-cost prices of oil will be significantly stressed. And those high-cost prices of oil are principally the international oil companies, the Shells and the BPs of this world. And those business models, if you look at their CapEx cuts are implying a Brent price for them of $90 to $95. So they need that pretty much to make their economics work. And if that price isn't coming back, those companies are going to be under a really significant amount of strain. Where that will show up operationally will be first and foremost in the Arctic, secondly in deep water, and third on the LNG side. So the heavy CapEx projects are the ones that are going to be principally affected by that.
Interesting. Frank, since you study Iraq, I'm curious about, and we go back to the Middle East, because when people think about oil, they think about the Middle East, even though we'll talk later about how they need to think about Canada more than they think about the Middle East. But what does the future hold for an organization like OPEC? One can read an awful lot of discussions about oil price today, and OPEC comes up as an afterthought. Now, I'm younger than some people in this audience, older than most, and when I remember discussions of oil, the first thing on everybody's mind was OPEC. So what happens to, as a geopolitical factor, what happens to an organization like that?
You know, if I could follow up on the comment that you made just a few minutes ago, I think it was Warren Buffett said that you don't know who's naked until the tide goes out. Well, the tide has gone out. The tide of high oil prices has gone out. And now it's revealed there are many winners around the world, some surprising winners, some surprising losers. Everybody talks about how Egypt is a winner because its energy prices are down, but now they have to be concerned they're not going to be earning the remittances that their workers are earning in the Middle East. But who are the big losers? I would say there are 5 countries that the tide has gone out and it's revealed that there's no there. And the big losers in my list would have to be Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria, and Iraq. Iraq is in its perfect storm. But of these, I'd say the country in the worst situation is Iran. It has so many issues, both short and long term. The only thing it had going for it was, at least temporarily, the oil production was going down, was the high levels of oil prices. And now that that's gone, now that makes for an ugly neighborhood when your neighbor looks ahead into the future and sees that their best times are behind them. And I think that Russia and Iran and Venezuela are going to become very bad neighbors just for that reason, that they see themselves as becoming steadily weaker, steadily less important, steadily an afterthought, and they're going to act now while they still can. OPEC, I was in the UAE and last month, and oil prices had already been down for 6 months. So I kept trying to find out, how are you going to cut back? How are you going to adjust your budget? And the response was, we're not. You know, we've saved up, we have this huge sovereign wealth fund, and after all, oil prices are going to go back up next year. So if the oil prices only fall for a year or two, then, you know, the only good thing about this evening were the drinks and the food that we had downstairs before it began. But if oil prices...
No small thing.
I concur. But if oil prices go down and stay down, then I think, especially with these 5 countries, I think the world is going to become a very ugly place.
Well, and I was thinking about this when I was talking to people during the cocktail hour, right? That I believe that the UAE has a large sovereign wealth fund. I know that Norway has a large sovereign wealth fund. But for states like Venezuela and Russia come to mind. When oil was at $100 a barrel, right, they were certainly making a lot of money, but they were also spending a lot of money on a lot of things. And so I'm a little unclear. Is there a Venezuelan or a Russian sovereign wealth fund that they have a big cushion for these sorts of things? Woj, do you have any thoughts on that?
Venezuela, not that I don't know.
Uh-huh.
No.
Neither does
Yeah,
Nicolas Maduro, right? Steve, you say you
They've
think
been
not?
burning through cash like it's going out of style.
That was my impression.
I was going to answer your China question.
Bring it. You can bring that
I
out.
wasn't trying to deflect like
That's
a
all
good
right.
politician.
Don't worry. I wasn't going to let you off the hook.
I think, broadly speaking, what you're looking at is some serious problems within certain oil-producing regions. Mm-hmm. The biggest problem, I think, that's facing us right now is Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm. If you look back about 1 to 2 years ago, when Ed Morse's report out of Citibank came out, and they were predicting the North American energy renaissance by 2032, and that date is changing. The big question was, how is this going to affect geopolitics? Are we still going to patrol the sea lanes? Are we still going to have an interest in the Middle East? And I think the resounding answer is yes. And I think that answer was that question was answered today when the president sought authorization to send troops to fight ISIS. Iraq seems relatively stable at this point. The worst case scenario that I would foresee happening within the next 5 years is a full sectarian war. And my inner voice keeps saying go moderate, but I'm going to camp out some extreme ground. And then you can badger me later.
I'd be disappointed if somebody didn't go ahead.
Everything's going to be just fine.
Oh, well then, thank you, everybody.
There we go.
There's a book written by a former French legionnaire. It was published, I believe, in the 70s. It was out of print, and by 2005, the DoD requested numerous copies. And I believe on page 172, he states specifically, the one country you don't want to fight a counterinsurgency in is Iraq. But if you do find yourself in that position, here are the variables that you should measure your success by. And when I read this book, it was in about 2008, we were failing on the majority of the variables. So why is Iraq going to crumble? Precisely because what is occurring there right now is exactly what Saddam Hussein was able to contain through horrific methods, but he was able to maintain peace. And you have 3 groups of people who are very willing to engage in combat and kill each other. You have neighbors who are more than willing to send people and material to meet those goals. And what I think is by the year 2000 is what you're going to see, short of a third act led by a Western coalition, is you're going to see Iraq crumble. If that happens, that's going to spread out through the rest of the Middle East. Right now, Yemen is pretty much awash. Libya is awash. As an oil outputter, Libya is gone. And segueing into your China question, for a while the concern was that China was buying up all this equity oil, and they're going to somehow corner the market, which was completely false. The majority of the oil is not open to equity deals. And China had found out the difficult way that those types of direct investment bilateral deals simply don't work, and they're getting bitten by that right now. They lost all their investments in Libya. They've doubled down on Venezuela, but they're not getting anything out of it, and they're certainly not going to be getting much out of it now. They are continually seeking deals in Saudi Arabia. At one point in time, it was thought that Iraq was going to be this perfect model of nation building because they have this natural funding machine of oil exports. Well, it turns out that the Western companies really had no interest in dealing with Iraq, but the Chinese were willing. So apparently a 12-man security team was not going to get the Western executive there, but the Chinese diplomat did go. That's beginning to show strains. So China is switching over from this direct deal where I argue that they were getting some sort of political benefit for it 2 years ago. And they're switching over to the market model, which is a good thing. The bad thing is that we were expecting poor China numbers for the last year. They're coming in now. And nobody really knows what to expect with China because they have nearly unlimited funding. So we're dealing with a situation now that we're way past the potential for a Great Depression. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It's a brave new world. So this is where geopolitics really starts to come in.
Indeed. Well, and actually, I want to follow up on this too. Is when people talk about fracking, when people talk about tar sands, right? There was often a lot of talk about North American energy independence, which would somehow allow North America, or at least this was implied if not directly said, it would allow North America to be free from worrying about what happens in the Middle East, to be free from worrying about what happens with oil, because we'll be getting it all from our Canadian brothers and sisters, or from North Dakota, which is pretty close to the same thing.
Farther south.
And further,
farther south.
and even further south. But Steve, I want to ask you about this. Does energy independence, is this a concept worth even discussing? Is there such a thing as energy or petroleum independence?
Well, yeah, as an accounting matter, sure.
Okay.
So the vision that Frank lays out for you is fundamentally one of U.S. energy independence. How do you keep oil prices at $60 or $70? Because U.S. shales are blowing the doors off. Because that is literally what is depressing prices, right? So if you say that's going to be for an extended period of time, which I probably don't agree with, but let's say I do, then that implies that U.S. production will continue to increase at roughly the pace we've seen. So more than 1 million barrels to 1.5 million. If you count up how many years you have to do that to energy independence, it's around 2018, 2020. At that point, the U.S. becomes a net oil exporter, okay? So if that vision holds up, now the question is, does it hold up? Yeah, we'll see, we don't know. But that's certainly there. Where that's showing up now as an economic matter is in our current account. So oil exports are traditionally as much as 40%, sometimes even more of our current account deficit. That's now reducing at a very rapid pace, but the current account as a whole has stabilized. What that means is now the U.S. has become this giant engine sucking in imports from around the world, and we've now become the driver again of global growth through our imports because our overall deficit is staying stable, but our petroleum deficit is declining, and the difference is now going to imports of other stuff. So from that point of view, it's quite important. It's quite important in the strength of our economy, the strength of our currency, in our self-confidence. It's all very important. The question is, if I were China, I would still be quite concerned about what does U.S. commitment to the Middle East look like in 2020? Because the Middle East will continue to be an incredibly important source of supply, particularly for China, where you'll have 17 or maybe 20 million barrels of oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz every day, of which perhaps half or more may end up in China. So if you look at that, you say, who is providing security at the Strait of Hormuz? And today, that's the U.S. Navy. So will it be there at that time?
Well, a geopolitical question comes to mind, right? One of the criticisms of China and Russia, before Russia, for example, provided other reasons for criticism, was that China and Russia were depending on the United States to maintain an international system, and that China and Russia were essentially free riders. If anything, they were not only free riders, but when it came to dealing with issues of international governance, they were actively hindering American policy. Does the need for does China's recognition that they continue to need oil from the Middle East, and so therefore that they have an interest in maintaining world trade routes and stability and making sure everybody gets along, does this make China a better global citizen? Frank, I know you wanted to say something about something. I want to let you say that, but I want to throw, if you wanted to comment on China, go ahead.
This
Bring it
raises
on.
the issue of the future of OPEC.
Yeah.
OPEC has two countries in it, Saudi Arabia and Iraq, that can take oil out of the ground and put it aboard a ship for less than $10 a barrel. Anything over $10 a barrel, Iraq and Saudi Arabia make money. So as long as they control so much of the world's low-cost oil and can get it cheaply aboard a ship, then that's going to give OPEC relevancy, even though if you look at the percentages have dropped. Now, Iraq in January, last month, had its highest level of oil production that it's had since 1979, since just before the invasion of Iran. Now, ISIS controls 40% of the territory of the country, 25% of the population. A war is going on there, and Iraq has the highest level of oil production and the highest level of oil exports that it's ever had. Why? Because 85% of the oil comes from Basra province. It's 15 miles from the oil fields to putting it aboard a ship. It's deep in the Shia region. There has been no trouble from the insurgency there. The KRG has the other 15%. They used to have to send the oil through Kirkuk. They don't anymore. They and the Turks have completed a pipeline which avoids the ISIS area. So even though they lost 40% of their country and 25% of their population, their oil production is going up to high levels. So as long as Iraq and Saudi Arabia have this price advantage, then OPEC is going to be relevant.
$10 a barrel? Really?
$10 a barrel, anything over $10 we can make money. In fact, I think the figures I've seen for Saudi Arabia is $5 or $6 a barrel, which I don't believe.
There's differences between total costs and lifting costs and cash costs and marginal costs. So but it's fair to say that they're still the low-cost producers.
Yes.
Well, I remember not too long ago reading books and articles that said that we had approached peak oil, and that therefore the world was about to face. This is when prices were going higher and higher, and we were obviously going to run out of oil. Now, of course, once again, I'm old enough to remember the 1970s and billboards that showed a picture of the world with the gas gauge on it and the needle on E because we were running out of energy then too. What happened to the peak oil discussion, Woj?
Well, thankfully I didn't participate in that one.
This is when you talk about staking out a radical
Yes.
position, making a prediction.
Yeah, I resisted the urge. The publisher did want me to discuss it, and I came up with a good, the bad, and the ugly scenarios. But I think past publications are a testament to how little we knew.
All right.
They were just wrong. I mean, if you look at economists' predictions, no offense to economists, well, a little.
No offense taken.
We're all friends.
If you
here.
look at economists' predictions, they're always status quo biased, or they contradict themselves and they're always optimistic. Iraq's burning, Russia's invading, but it's going to be okay. And so on the peak oil issue, I simply think we didn't know. And when you look at past net assessments and then a large status quo changing event occurs, you look at the assessments and they were all wrong. Right. So is it the analysis, is it the data, or is it that there's so much leeway that no matter how much brain power you put into it, that it's...
I'll pipe in.
Yeah, please do.
I am a figure in the peak oil debate.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of issues in peak oil. So what did everybody get wrong? What they got wrong was technological development. Okay. Right. So if you look at every energy crisis or the recent ones, what happens is that the existing sources of supply actually do peak out. And what happens is that a new source of supply is then brought on. So in the 1970s, a new source of supply was the US Gulf, Alaska, and the North Sea. Okay. Now the new source of supply is shale. The problem with technological development, and it's the problem we're having right now as analysis in the industry, is that you can't use a linear analytical tool. So it's a faith, act of God, faith, trust me, it will be okay, right? And those people annoyed the bejesus out of me, frankly. But to date, they've been right. So that's one side of it. The second thing is, let's keep in mind that US shales and Canadian oil sands are 100% of supply growth since 2005. that the oil supply, but for those, which is maybe 9 or 10 million barrels, so 10% of the global oil supply, but for those, the oil supply is peaked out. So peak oil has not gone away, and we are fully leveraged to the continued success of shales in addressing this question, which is not a given. It is not a given. And okay, let me now go over my allotted time and tell you why it's not a given. The reason is that China is still out there and China is still a big country. So China's steady state oil consumption should be 2 to 2.5 times that of the United States, and it should be there by 2035. So China on paper could suck down a US worth of consumption in the next 5 to 7 years if its economy decides to go that way. So the potential demand on the system is still incredibly large. The incremental sources of supply are certainly impressive, but they're not proven at the magnitude that China is capable to draw if its economy is hitting on all cylinders.
This is, Frank, you want to add something to that? Go
Yes,
ahead.
please. Yeah, but just to disagree.
That's fine.
Well, by all means.
Yeah. When I was at Hopkins decades ago, Alan Walters was one of my professors, and he was Margaret Thatcher's economic advisor, and he had us read an 1840, 1845 editorial about the end of industry in the United Kingdom, the end of the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom was running out of forests to burn in the steam engines, and that was going to be the end of industry. Ever since Malthus, we keep having these peak wood, peak coal, peak peat, peak oil. Of course,
Peak Pete,
you know,
yes,
when,
those were the Peak Pete. Those were
Peak peaks.
There was a huge
Those were-
dialogue
Well,
on that, right?
When the cost of something becomes rises, then you can expect the technological innovation. Now, that sounds like the wishful thinking that I think you can criticize. But if you look at the last 200 years, there hasn't been this barrier of eventually we're going to run out of wood, we're going to run out of peat, we're going to run out of coal, we're going to run out of oil. As far as the fracking revolution, France is frackable, but the government has decided they're not going to do it. China seems to have the sites that would lend themselves to fracking, but the Chinese government has not yet decided they're going to do it.
It's not clear
So-
that's true for oil.
Yeah, and New York City, which is a primitive place east of here, has decided that they're not going to allow
I hear.
fracking in their state.
Occasionally news comes from there, I believe.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay. All right.
But, well, I'm curious about this, right? You talk about that there's been technological advances. To use a good example, right? We never reached the point of peak coal, right? For example, in places like the Ruhr or in places like Newcastle, there is still plenty of coal in the ground, but nobody bothers to dig it up anymore. Coal is still being used like crazy. But one of the reasons why we never ran out of coal, or is we haven't run out of coal yet, is because oil came along. And of course, it brought all kinds of economic and social dislocations as well as changes. So are we then, when we talk about if peak oil has not gone away, and is the answer to avoiding, if fracking does not provide a long-term answer or a permanent answer to peak oil, what obviously would is, let's burn something else instead. Let's use something else instead. Right? That's what oil replaced coal, coal replaced the forests replaced peat. But where are we in that search for something else to replace oil? As long as the price is this low, it's hard to get anybody all that interested in the alternatives.
I'll give it to you.
So let's talk
Well,
about alternative oil.
I was going to say there's not only the impact on the supply side, but there's the impact on the demand side as well. When oil was $100 a barrel, jet fuel was extremely expensive, and Boeing and Airbus came up with some very sophisticated engines to conserve fuel. The American automobile industry, the efficiency of the gasoline engine has gone up dramatically. We're not going to give that up now that oil and jet fuel has become cheaper. We're going to continue to use the techniques. So there's a ratchet effect on the demand. Every time oil prices go up, we become more efficient in its usage. We don't give that up again when oil prices fall.
Well, not all of it, right? We don't
Not
have
all.
country squires, but we do have Escalades.
I'm sorry?
We don't have country squire station wagons circa 1973. We do have Cadillac Escalades. So there are
But
still
the young
vehicles.
people are all moving back in the urban areas, giving up their cars and riding metro. Yes? Yes, okay.
Yes, okay. Steve, you wanted to say something about alternative fuels?
Well, I think the efficiency gains that we've seen have been really disappointing. the aircraft fuel burn. I also have a book coming out, by the way. Oil in Scarcity and Plenty is the name of the book, and the draft is done.
Bring it on. That's why we have you here, by all means.
Aircraft fuel burn has not really improved a whole lot since 2000. What they've done is with the new aircraft, they've shed some weight. Yeah, the engines are a little more efficient. They've got these little winglets on them, but this is really hard for these airlines. I mean, Boeing still doesn't have the MAX series out 10 years after oil prices have gone up. It's not a particularly pretty story, and it's really not that great for automobile oil consumption either. It's up 4% or something in that period. So maybe that gets better as these more fuel-efficient cars work their way through the fleet. But it doesn't leap off the page at you that, wow, we've really been able to just overcome this. If you think the changes in automobiles that happened from 1975 to 1985, right? It was completely different. If you think about the cars in 2005 and 2015, I got to tell you, my Honda minivan doesn't look a whole lot different than it did 10 years ago. So, I'm not really overwhelmingly impressed at how much efficiency gains we've seen. We will continue to see some for the reasons Frank has indicated. As for other fuels, there are batteries. They remain very expensive. I think self-driving cars will be linked to that somehow. And then there's natural gas, and there's very little enthusiasm around the world for using natural gas for transportation fuel.
Well, I think that we should include some of the rest of our guests in this discussion. Eli Gilman has a microphone in his hand. If anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, raise your hand, get Eli's attention. We have one young man right here has a question. Go right ahead.
I noticed you referred to me as a young man. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's actually a fairly liberal standard of getting classified as a young man. It's a nice place to be. I'm coming back tomorrow. I think this is following up on a comment Frank made. Frank commented that he sees Iran and Russia as two of his particular problems, and the world's going to be a difficult place in those two areas. And I guess I've been watching sanctions. I've heard about sanctions on Iran and sanctions on Russia and so on. And I'm still waiting for sanctions to take up what we perceive as a bad behavior and make them a good behavior. Yeah. Maybe that's going to happen someday. But I guess my question is, you don't seem very optimistic, and I guess this is for the three of you, you don't seem very optimistic that sanctions in Iran are going to lead to Iran becoming a good citizen on this nuclear issue. And I guess I'd be interested in comments on that. And I'd be more interested perhaps in comments on Russia's behavior, whether you have anything to add to that. And they're having terrible economic difficulties in both of those countries because of petroleum. And what's it going to do with respect to their conduct, and is there anything hopeful we could think of?
So we'll be back to this thing, is if Russia and Iran they misbehaved in the 2000s because oil was at $100 a barrel. Oil is now at $50 a barrel. There are, at least theoretically, sanctions upon both those states. Should we expect to see big changes in behavior?
No.
So far, no, there we go. There's one answer.
Okay.
That's right. Let's move.
Yeah,
Moving on, Steve.
Let me elaborate that. No.
No, also no. And Frank?
Yeah, I think the thing about Iran, and again, it's the oil is concealing, and now that the oil is gone, here's a country that there's nothing else. The World Bank does its ease of doing business survey. Iran is one of the worst countries in the world to try to establish a private business. As far as corruption, Transparency International puts it down at the bottom. It is one of the most corrupt countries on the face of the earth. Something that intrigues me is looking at fertility rates. Iran has the most rapid drop in fertility in the world. We've never seen a drop in fertility. It went from the average woman having 4.5 children to the average woman having 1.9 children, below replacement, in one generation. Now, why do women stop having children? There could be a variety of reasons, but one reason is that the future is grim. There's nothing to look ahead of. So you have a country that has nothing but oil, that is incredibly corrupt, that is incredibly mismanaged, that the people live in that country have lost hope in the future, and they're aging at a very rapid rate. That kind of country is dangerous. It's dangerous to its neighbors. It's like when Rome was heading down, it became more violent because they felt if they didn't act now, in 5 years, in 20 years, they won't be able to. I think that's the situation of Iran. Russia isn't probably quite as grim, incredibly corrupt. It's the only country in the world where the life expectancy of men is decreasing. Not of women, but just of men. Mostly alcoholism, but automobile accidents contribute to that. Without oil, somebody said it's Belgium with nuclear weapons. You know,
We'll say, actually, Helmut Schmidt famously said it's Upper Volta with nuclear weapons.
even a step worse.
We have a question right here.
Yeah.
Okay.
This, but some of the people I read that I think are politically agnostic have said that they think that the estimates for what we're going to get from fracking are very overstated, that the deeper you go, the more inefficient the process is because it needs more oil and water to run the process. And when I ask this question of investment people, the answer I get is, well, technology is going to bail us out. And do you have any more thoughts on that, anything in more detail?
Well, you know, I read a lot of analysis. I read enough analysis right now, I don't even believe myself. But, but what we can see, so sometimes if you're a banker, the question is, what have you done for me recently, right? What's the recent track record? The recent track record is at $100, shales could produce 1.6 million barrels per day of growth. That's a pretty good number, and that's plenty enough to tank prices. What we'll need going forward from shales is about 800,000 barrels per day per year growth. So about half of global growth. At $70, $80, that looks feasible right now for a while. Is that while 2 years, 5 years, 12 years? I don't know. I've seen resource estimates from 16 gigabarrels to 100 gigabarrels, right? So right now we're sitting here and we're kind of passengers. I mean, even guys who are really good at this business are going, you know, what's productivity growth going to be? And you know, I've seen some wonderful trend lines and going, oh yeah, productivity growth, that's great. You know, how high a building can you dive off into a pool? Well, yeah, you can keep going up for a while and then you can't. So I think at this point it's very difficult to say with any certainty where the upper bound is. Shales have demonstrated, however, that they can produce the necessary growth for the oil supply at some reasonable price for their share for the intermediate future. So I would say at 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, they're able to produce that 800,000 barrels. That's about what it appears that it can do today.
One more question here. Yes.
Hi. I had actually several questions regarding 3 different countries. One, Iran and Russia, it was already asked. But I would like to just ask you to elaborate, with their heavy dependence on oil exports, how they are able to continue to, how Russia is able to continue their activities in Ukraine and also Iran regarding their nuclear stance. But the other question that I want to focus on is with China. You mentioned earlier that there's a free rider problem with China, especially with the oil running through Strait of Hormuz and Strait of Malacca, and how U.S. provides that freedom of navigation security. This really is a two-edged sword because I mean, China is growing rapidly. It's devoting a large percentage of its resources, developing its military capabilities, especially developing Blue Water Navy. So on one hand, it's good that they're doing that so that they can maybe reduce the burden that the U.S. provides. But on the other hand, it's causing a lot of heartache in the neighborhood because of it's sort of what seems to be a very aggressive stance in the region. So I was just wondering if you had any comments related to that.
Sure. Woj?
Well, I think you asked this question about China being a good global citizen, and that will answer it. China, there's a public dialogue for China. There's a private dialogue for China that you can get from diplomats and off-the-record conversations. China says that it is a good global citizen. We've been wanting it to be this responsible stakeholder, and they make claims such as they give the largest percentage of peacekeepers of all the Security Council member nations, and that's true. But when you compare that to the whole of the UN, they're in the 70s. Actually, Bangladesh gives more troops to peacekeeping operations. So there isn't a whole lot of faith within the Chinese leadership on this idea of being a good global citizen. There's actually a fair amount of distrust in that. There was a fair amount of distrust in the energy markets. So does China not want the U.S. to patrol the Strait of Hormuz? They completely want the U.S. to patrol the Strait of Hormuz because there's no one else. In 2008, the UK cut their naval expenditures by 10%. That had to be made up by the U.S. So if there's no U.S. patrolling the sea lanes, there's no one patrolling the sea lanes except for some private contracting companies. China started doing out-of-area naval operations about 5 years ago. Generally, they've been successful. Now they're porting the ships, but they're nowhere near any type of ability where they can go out of area for long term as a blue water navy. Their focus is really in the South China Sea and towards that first island chain. So in reality, it's still up to the U.S. And what you're seeing with this move of extending hostilities against ISIS, it's partly because of ISIS, but it's really a geopolitical explanation. You're looking at one of the top 3 oil producers. 40% of the country is going to hell. This is the most vile group of people in modern times that's functioning on the face of the earth, and we are going back in. Although they keep saying it's in a limited fashion, 2 years ago, I'm pretty sure the president would have said, hell no, there's no way we're ever going back in there. And the realities just changed those decisions. So China is free riding, but at the same time, it's in our best interest to keep China stable. There are arguments that the last 10 years of economic growth in China has been credit-based. We really don't know. Even the people we get our numbers from aren't sure what the real numbers are. So it's still, we're back to, we'll do the best quantitative analysis, we'll assume everything else remains equal, but like Steve pointed out, you can't assume technological advances to stay equal. But I don't know if I would be so hopeful as to say that technology will save us.
It's an interesting problem for a future conversation about the United States might complain about free riders, but is the United States really willing to share management responsibility? That's a larger question. We have a question right over here.
Thank you. So you talked earlier about one of the major losers from low oil prices were these 5 countries. The other one is the multinationals that you also discussed. Right. As I understand it, those multinationals in the oil service industry itself, companies like Schlumberger and Halliburton, et cetera, provide a large percent of the technology for the new big CapEx projects.
Correct.
When both of those industries are hit, does that mean that the long-term development of new resources like Sakhalin Island and the northern area, the Yamal Peninsula, et cetera, are those significantly hindered for the future, and how does that affect the entire picture?
Yeah, I mean,
Go
if I
ahead.
can make this. So the question that you're asking is whether Frank's vision of the future is well grounded or not, right? So shales. Well,
Let's not
no,
go
I
that
mean,
far.
it's not a trivial question. It's if I'm flip, I didn't mean to be, but well, no, I did mean to be, but I didn't mean to be. Anyway, so shales now are in the middle of the cost curve, right? And at the top of the cost curve, at the very top, we have the oil sands, we have the Arctic, and we have deep water, right? So if this middle part stays just in the middle and China's demand is at the far end, then the IOCs will be able to get some stuff in there. But I mean, they've been under a huge amount of pressure for years now, and their capital productivity is really terrible. But so they'll be able to hang on somewhere at the end. If these shales push out significantly and are able to do so at, let's say, $80 or $85 Brent, I mean, these IOCs are going to be in a world of trouble. I mean, a lot of trouble. And then that means that as long as the shale revolution lasts, or until someone figures out how to do deep water a lot cheaper, right, their value proposition is going to be severely challenged. They're not at the bottom yet here, guys. The IOCs are not even close to how bad things could get there yet.
One more question. Yes.
So, gentlemen, I wanted to ask you about Saudi Arabia and a series of questions. First of all, given the change that we recently saw in Saudi Arabia, do you see any potential for change in Saudi Arabia's relationship with the United States and their behavior as a global player in the energy market? Secondly, as the U.S. is moving closer and closer to that position of being the swing state, do you see any potential trouble in the relationship, which has been particularly special, to put it mildly, between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia? And lastly, given the boiling trouble in the Middle East, and particularly the situation in Syria, we all know there's been some kind of quote tension between Saudi Arabia and Russia, for example, over Russia's support for the incumbent regime. Do you foresee, or do you believe that there may have been a degree of collusion between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, as a form of a conspiracy theory for the drop in prices and keeping the supply levels particularly high in the past several months?
Frank.
Excellent question. The Saudis, I think, first of all, I don't see the change in government as having any impact on policy. Even if they considered a change in policy, maybe letting the quantity of oil produced go down so they could raise the price, they wouldn't, because there was a change in government. You want to present confidence. You want to present continuity. Secondly, the low oil prices have devastated Saudi's major regional competitor, Iran. The fact that it's injuring Russia as well is just gravy, is just frosting on top of the cake. The low oil prices have devastated Iran. Is it necessary for the Americans and the Saudis to meet in some Georgetown pub to plot this? No. I think the incentives were both were very clear. I'm sorry?
It's the Hilton.
Yes, the incentives were very clear for both the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. I don't think a conspiracy was necessary. I think it was something in the Hilton coffee shop.
All right. Well, good.
I think
go
just to follow up, Michael Clare put out a number of pieces. One of them, he's arguing that the U.S. did collude with Saudi Arabia. They're starting to use oil as a weapon, precisely against Iran and Russia. But how far will that go? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much there is to substantiate that. But the biggest problem, I think, with Saudi Arabia, as far as stability goes, is that the media is not covering the numbers of young Saudis that are going to join ISIS. So when we, in our alliance, are bombing ISIS, we're actually bombing Saudi citizens. When Saudi Arabia is participating in that, they're bombing their own citizens. So the big question, I think the big measure is, will Saudi Arabia fall? Of course, that's outrageous now. 3 years from now, it may not be as outrageous. But we'll be wondering in this traditional conventional warfare approach, well, when will the conflict reach out to Saudi Arabia? And I think it already has. It has begun to. The same people who participated in the 9/11 attacks are now joining ISIS, and we are effectively fighting them to a small degree, but it has begun. And I think that's how that contagion, the conflict contagion, could possibly spread.
Great. From the back, yes.
Out of the players you're talking about, the bad neighbor players, one of them, Iran, has a nuclear capability that's probably relatively close, within several years at least, of going online. Yeah. One, given your falling player scenario. Two, given the sometimes fanatical theocracy there, just how bad, assuming the Israelis don't take that capability out, just how bad of a player are we talking?
Well, it's a good question, right? Because Iran certainly argues one of the reasons why they want to develop their nuclear potential is because they want to reduce their dependence on oil, ironically enough, so they can sell more of it and use less.
I think the Ukraine provides some insight here. The Ukraine, at the end, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1989, whenever it collapsed, the Ukraine had a significant nuclear capability. And the U.S. negotiated a deal where the nuclear weapons would be taken out of the Ukraine, returned to Russia, and in return, the U.S. would provide a guarantee until the end of time of Ukraine's sovereignty. We see how well that worked out. I think Iran realizes that, especially with the collapse of oil prices and the population aging and the economy staggering, that without nuclear weapons, it's not going to have any respect. It's going to be Belgium without nuclear weapons.
And without chocolates.
I'm sorry?
And without chocolates.
Or beer.
So I think that I think that they are going to consider it necessary for their national pride, and they're not going to give it up. They'll negotiate, they'll make concessions if they have to, but this is a dream they're not going to give up.
have to say the entire question of Iran and American policy towards Iran could keep us busy for a very long time.
3 or 4 weeks.
So we have time for one more question from the audience, though. So please.
We all saw what happened with the Keystone pipeline today, and I have a hunch what will happen next. But I'm curious your thoughts on what will happen in the next 6, 12, 18 months with the Keystone pipeline, or whatever the next project that you're going to call it will be.
I'm so glad somebody asked about Keystone XL. I had it on my list, and I was waiting to see if it was going to come up. And let me add to this. What happened today was the Congress voted, they passed it, so that it goes to the president. I want to build on that. This larger question, right, is when people talk about pipelines like Keystone XL or like the Penn East pipeline, which there was recently an article about the idea of a pipeline that would run from up in the shale fields down through into northern New Jersey. There's all this talk about the enormous dollars in economic activity and the thousands of jobs it will create. What sense can we make of those kinds of claims? What is the actual significance of a project like Keystone XL?
It's to give people like us something to disagree about. In
that sense, it's already a success.
Well, Keystone is a useful piece of infrastructure. It moves oil around. There are other pipelines that move oil around. We move a tremendous amount by rail. From my perspective, you don't want to move oil by rail. It's both high cost and a higher risk than by pipeline. But Keystone XL, yeah, I mean, this is like the Republicans voting for, I don't know what. I mean, it's a Republican thing. It's going to go to the president. He'll probably veto it unless they put it into some package that he can't say no to, right? Some larger package. But it's essentially a symbolic gesture. But it's also symbolic on the other side. The amount of CO2 you'd save if Keystone were never built is equal to 1 week's global emissions over its lifetime. So, I mean, if you'd come here a week ago, well, okay, sorry, too late. So it's really not a significant project in terms of either its commitment, its contribution to CO2, or its importance in logistics. It does reduce costs, it makes things easier, but it's become a really symbolic issue, much more in some ways than a substantive one.
But it did give us something to talk about.
It did.
And
certainly did.
Unfortunately, this conversation has to come to an end, right? We've been talking for a good solid hour, and I want to thank my guests, our guests, Woj Wolf, Steve Kopitz, Frank Gunter, for joining us, sharing your insights. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this conversation. Of course, the conversation continues, right? At FPRI, one of the things that we do is we like to bring people together for these kinds of conversations and presentations. If you have enjoyed what you've heard and seen tonight, I hope you will tell a friend, and that you will bring a friend next time, that you'll take a look at the materials that we've left for you on FPRI, that you will like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, and let us know what you think about what we do and what we can do for you to help you to learn more about our complex world. But for this conversation and for tonight, on behalf of everybody at FPRI, on behalf of our friends at BNY Mellon Wealth Management, on behalf of our friends from the First Troop, I'm Ron Granieri, and thank you so much for joining us.